What are we doing with this one life that we've got to live? And regardless of what people believe about the afterlife, the reality is this life we're living as we know it is going by pretty fast. And what are we doing with it?
Yeah, I think you're right. How do we stay present in the moment? Because, that idea that we only have this one life, and how do we make the most of it? Because as you know, I love that saying, for instance, the days feel really long, but the years are really short. And so I think being a mom and being a CEO and wanting to just be a really good member of society, it just every day is okay, when I put my head down on the pillow, can I feel as though I did my best work?
This is the Turn Your Life Around podcast, and I'm the 180 lady. I've been helping people turn their lives around since 2007 as the founder and CEO of a large mental health company. The purpose of this podcast is to have meaningful conversations with old friends and new friends, everyday people just like you and me, about how they turn their lives around. We'll discuss all things mental health, fitness, finances, relationships, parenting, spirituality, you name it. My hope is that you can take something away that will encourage you today. I'm your host, Sarah Coates. Are you ready to turn your life around? Hello and welcome to the podcast. I'm joined today by Shantel Sullivan. She is a practicing LCSW licensed clinical social worker of over 15 years. She completed her doctorate in educational leadership from the University of New England, and she started her career working with adolescents, then took some time away to navigate the professional development of employees within a hospital system. Then she became a professor at Western Carolina, and most recently, she's the CEO of Bright Path Behavioral Health. She started that in 2023, and I think actually today is your 1-year anniversary.
Yes. Oh my goodness, Sarah. Thank you so much for having me here. And you're right. This is a big week. On Friday will not only be my 1-year anniversary being the CEO of Bright Path, but also my 40th birthday, which was so serendipitous in reading your YOLO article recently. So I'm excited to be here and chatting with you today.
Yeah, 40. That's a milestone.
Yeah, it's definitely, I think that you were talking about, age is kind of relative, and sort of that call to action you had about living your best life. I think that each year I just spend time thinking about 3 things. How do I stay authentic to me? And authentic in both of those spaces of trying to be true to my career aspirations and career goals while also being a mom, right? And so kind of navigating authenticity, that both of those things are so full of joy, but also incredibly challenging. And, the world isn't always set up for us to be successful. And as behavioral health practitioners, we know that sometimes we can be our biggest critic. And so the other piece is just staying compassionate, compassionate towards myself, which can be really difficult, right? Authenticity and staying compassionate to self.
Yeah. Do you have any big plans for your 40th?
Well, so a couple of weeks ago, some of my friends and then my friends' friends, we all went to Hilton Head and sort of had a pre-birthday culmination of all of us turning 40 within this year. But a little bird told me that on Saturday, my husband has planned a birthday party.
Yeah.
So I'm excited.
That's exciting.
We'll see what he pulls off.
Yeah. Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
Well, you mentioned that article. I do a blog for my team. And I wrote about you only live once, because this week I turned 48, and that's creeping up pretty close to 50, which I think about 50 and I'm like, oh my gosh, that's literally like a half a century. And not to be morbid or anything, but you start creeping up on 40, 50, it really puts into perspective, how many more years do I actually have on this planet? And what am I doing with them?
Yeah.
And, somebody I was talking to on the way here actually was talking about not living to work, but working to live. And so, I was kind of doing a call to action in my blog to my team, hey guys, oh, wake up. I mean, some of them may already be awake, but you know what I mean? Like I was telling myself also, like, wake up, what are we doing with this one life that we've got to live? And regardless of what people believe about the afterlife, the reality is this life we're living as we know it is going by pretty fast. And what are we doing with it?
Yeah, I think like you're right. Like, how do we stay present in the moment? Because, you know, that idea that we only have this one life, and how do we make the most of it? Because as you know, I love that saying, for instance, like the days feel really long, but the years are really short. And so I think like being a mom and being a CEO and wanting to just be a really good member of society, it just every day is like, okay, when I put my head down on the pillow, like, can I feel as though I did my best work, right? Because I'm not competing against anyone or anything other than my best self. And so, you know, that's where that self-compassion also has to come in, because we have to be mindful of, like, again, parenting is hard. Running companies is hard. Being human is hard.
Yes.
Right? And so it's really just kind of like, all right, how can I do the best for others, for myself, and be kind and caring, recognizing like sometimes we're a 10. Sometimes we're like, we get it done, right? Like there are those good days. And then there's days where it's like, oh yeah, I am human and the to-do list didn't get done. Or, you know, I had to have a really difficult conversation with somebody that didn't go the way I wanted. Or, you know, maybe I was a little critical of my kid or short with my kid this morning.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. And practicing self-compassion each day. You know, as therapists, I mean, I'm a therapist also. I think we challenge our clients with, you know, putting self-compassion on themselves, utilizing that towards themselves. But then sometimes we are our worst critics and we're not actually applying compassion to our own selves. Is that the right grammar? Ourselves. Well, anyway.
Our own self. Yeah. Our own self. I don't know. But I love
I'm not an English major.
Yeah, that's right. I love that. And I always say, like, when Brene Brown one time, you know, talked about like, oh, I'm just going to make this a word for today.
Oh yeah,
like,
that's
I
good.
just like that ownership. Like, oh yeah, like this is me trying to be authentic. I'm just speaking from the heart and not overthinking my thinking.
Yeah, for sure. So this is the Turn Your Life Around podcast. And wondering if you can share a little bit about some of your turning points, your turning life around points. I know you've had a few.
Yeah, definitely. Well, I think that if you're going to stay authentic to yourself, if you truly challenge yourself to be authentic, that then requires some courage to make hard decisions. And in all of life's experiences, sometimes we're handed lemons, right? Sometimes we experience suffering or we experience rejection. And in those moments, I've had to sit really still and quiet and ask myself, like, okay, what is next? And sometimes those decisions have been of my own, right? And sometimes those have been other people's decisions, right? To say no or not now. And, you know, I think in sort of our pre-chat conversation, we were talking about being cheerleaders, right? And so one of my bucket list items is to write a book on the lessons of cheerleading, right? Like how that prepares you to be resilient and face adversity. And so I sort of like use that as the caveat just to kind of say, the first piece was actually I think like when I think about how the trajectory of my life sort of shifted, you know, like if you can kind of think about that like cosmic shift that occurs, I think some of that was in high school, in that like pivoting to where I am now and why I'm a therapist and why I do the work that I do was first and foremost, I had gotten sick right before basketball tryouts. So I'd always played like bitty basketball, and then I had gotten mono. So I missed basketball. And then I tried out for cheerleading. And I had danced but never been a cheerleader. And I didn't make the team.
Yeah.
Sad, difficult, freshman in high school. That's a hard thing. And I remember my coach at the time was like, you know what, just come back next year. And I did. And then I made the team. And she has this wonderful company now, and she just pivoted. It's called Bloom. But I think that having a positive mentor, first and foremost, shifts your trajectory. Having a major life incident, like that doesn't seem maybe that big to many, but knowing that I do work with adolescents, like,
oh yeah,
having your identity as a particular athlete shift is huge. But that sort of event catapulted me to then end up like developing really great relationships. And then, when I went to university, I wasn't going to get in because I wasn't at the time knowing how to manage being a student athlete or even being a student. And my parents were divorcing at the time. And so it's kind of like, okay, again, here I was faced with my friends had already like known where they were going to go, like had gotten into college, and I'm kind of floundering. And I ended up going to my like state home school.
Yeah.
And it was the best thing that could ever happen. Right. And that's when I fell in love with sociology, like human behavior, and sort of understanding like why people behave the way they do, why communities behave the way they do. And again, like when we talk about turning your life around, I think it's about connecting yourself to really good people and staying authentic and experiencing like when life hands you lemons, like, is it really rejection or, as they say, redirection?
Yeah.
Right. And so, yeah, I think like when you think about who you are and doing work with adolescents, I think it's important to like, where does it start? And it sort of starts there, shaping your identity. So I would say that was sort of the first pivotal point.
Yeah, I think I think you're saying some very powerful things. I hope people are listening and taking notes because, especially these days, there's a lot of hard going on for a lot of people. And, you can get squashed by that, or you can take it and, like you're saying, pivot, redirect yourself, create something new, use it as fuel to create something new instead of getting, burned by the fire, so to speak.
Yeah.
I think a lot of us, I include myself in that, can take that lesson.
Yeah. Yeah. So, from there, once I studied sociology, and then I was like, what's going to happen next? Sort of kind of just thinking about, preparing to turn 40. I'm like, what have I done each decade?
Yeah.
Right? Like, what has really transpired? And how did I get here? Like, and how did I, right? And it's really thinking about how did we? Because as you know, it's like standing on the back of everybody who's gotten to you to this point. And so I think it's strong mentors. They all happen to predominantly be like strong female mentors who have themselves paved new paths. And so, so then I was talking to a sociology professor, and I was like, okay, well, now what? Like, I'm going to graduate, right? So it goes so fast, right? 4 years, undergrad, then, okay, do I go to grad school? And at that point, I really, really wanted to go to Smith, to the Women's College in Massachusetts.
Okay.
And I had looked at a bunch of schools, and lo and behold, I didn't get into Smith either, right? Like, one of my really good friends got in. We both had applied together. I went. I was like, oh, this is where I really, 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 really want to be. And then the rejection letter comes, right? I got into the 2 other schools that I really wanted to go to. So I ended up at the University of New England and was studying a master's in social work, and then also was studying, in addition to that, addictions counseling. And so I think that was another opportunity, rejection turning into redirection. Like, I loved the University of New England. I made great relationships, and I practiced some courage, like a different level of courage for the first time. I studied abroad and started looking at how human trafficking was being impacted across the world. But that led me to kind of see like, oh, how do I navigate a different culture, a different environment? So again, courage leads to opportunity. And sometimes those opportunities come out of the hard nose that you weren't expecting.
Absolutely. Mm-hmm. Oh, that's so cool. So where did you travel? Where did you study?
Yeah. So it was a winter semester, and we were right in the heart of London, and we were looking at how human rights and human trafficking was really impacting young people, specifically like sex trafficking. So there's this great book. It's called Modern Slavery. My brain for a second. And we were looking at how that was really impacting our economy and sort of the silent behind the scenes impact of that. And that was a moment when I was like, okay, I'm really into like trauma and suffering, and how do we help people feel safe and heard and come back from really painful things. And I think that's when I decided to really focus on doing trauma work. And again, a lot of human trafficking or like modern day slavery is happening with children and teens, right? And so I had this like deep connection.
Yeah. And passion for working with adolescents.
Yeah. That's sort of been the thread.
Right. I do want to come back to that, but I also want to go back to, you mentioned earlier about wanting to write a book about cheerleaders.
Yeah.
And of course, I love to talk about cheerleaders because I was one too. I still sometimes feel sad. So I have 2 teenagers and neither of them are cheerleaders. And I look at them sometimes and think, how did I birth you? And neither of you are a cheerleader.
Yeah, right. Well, I have 2 tween daughters too, and neither of them will, I think, follow that line. Yeah. But yeah, I just think that like what cheerleading taught me was a couple of things. Challenge.
Yeah.
How people can judge, right? Because oftentimes there is this idea, I think that's why I was like, I'm gonna like show them how smart cheerleaders really are. Like, and how being a cheerleader sets you up to engage with the public, right? To advocate, to be an incredible team player, to know when your team is losing, you keep going, right? How do you keep that momentum to encourage others?
That's so good. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think that that's sort of like the basis of the book is like, how do you use these skill sets that you learn as a cheerleader to apply them to life and to resilience and working with teams, right? How have I really applied that into building organizational culture?
That's great. I think that'd be a great book.
Yeah.
I think sometimes when I reflect on my trajectory, my life story as being a cheerleader, I was a cheerleader in middle school and high school and college. Then I coached college cheerleading for a snippet, for several years actually. Thought I would, continue on with it as a career, but I didn't. But, I always had this identity, I think, as a young person of being the cheerleader, which also can come with dumb blonde, small, silly, or not even silly, but just kind of like, oh, she's just a cheerleader, right? And so even though I was a pretty good student, it's still, you kind of take on that identity of like just a blonde cheerleader, just a silly little cheerleader, right?
Yeah.
And I feel like sometimes that probably deep inside of me, if I was going to self-evaluate or self-analyze, it probably was like one of the driving forces that made me into who I am today and really fueled my fire of like doing something with my life and, trying to achieve great things.
Yeah. I think that too. For instance, like being a part of a team, I think is so important for young people and to find community and connection and belonging, while also, you're right, like being a cheerleader at that time perhaps was happening like 2 things. One, it's building character and relationships and connection, while also sometimes making you face some of those other elements of yourself that you might not like, right? That we can be really critical of. And so, I think it was also like so important to recognize, like being a cheerleader allowed me to, at some points, not suffer in silence because, you might have a hard time cheering for yourself, but you start cheering for someone else. Right. Or you have those relationships of your peers on your team, to kind of encourage and coach you along.
Yeah.
So for the self, I think like cheerleading or being a part of sports is so key.
Yeah.
And also like thinking about how it just shaped who I am now is being able to really lean into when the going got tough and when people sort of second guess, right? This 4'11",
Yeah.
right? Like, oh, you're 4'11".
Oh, you're so
cheerleader. Yeah, I'm like, yeah. And big things come in small boxes. Like,
Yes.
watch this. And so I think that was also an opportunity to say, hey, don't judge a book by its cover, right? Like, again, experiencing rejection and hearing no just can really push people and propel them forward. And I think like that piece of social work or being a social worker that's so important to me is helping to shift other people's judgments or bias. And it used to be really cool to do that in helping people reframe how you think about teenagers. I think that's why I also like Adolescence is because, hey, this is such a time of identity formation. And now I find myself, with tweens and having to take pause, like, oh, I am in the weeds of this now.
Yeah.
Like, all right, I'm having to now, before I was trying to perspective take, and now I am like in it.
Yeah.
And so figuring out how do we really, navigate adolescence, navigate humility through that lens.
Isn't it something raising teenagers these days?
Yeah.
It is. I find myself like, before I had teenagers, it was so easy to advise or guide parents on, what the textbook says about how to work with your teenager. And now I have them and I'm like, oh, okay, well, this is really how it is. Now I remember what those parents were going through.
Yeah. And I always say, like, especially being in the field of behavioral health and talking about emotional health, there are those books, What to Expect When You're Expecting, that really prepare us for the physical, biological, like kid gets the flu, do this, they get hives, they have this food allergy. But what I'm trying to be really good at is not only as a mom, but helping with Bright Path, being the CEO of Bright Path, is really becoming thought leaders on how do we understand teenagers? How do we understand adolescents? And really support them while also recognizing, like, I don't have all the answers either, not as a mom and not as a practitioner. And so how do we stay self-compassionate when we're stuck, when our kids are suffering and there is, no clear path to helping them heal quickly, right? Like if my kid falls in, that has happened at 3, my kid at a trampoline park fell and broke her leg, right?
No.
And it's like, okay, you go to the orthopedist, you get a cast, you wear it for 6 weeks, and then pretty much you're back to normal functioning. But with dealing with the changes in post-pandemic and just mental health, there is no clear path, right? There's no clear trajectory. And so I hold that as a mom. I hold that really important in my role at Bright Path and figuring out, like, what's the evidence say and what are parents saying? And I would, I pause because I don't want to put one person's opinion more than another, but I will say, I think it's so important that we listen to these teenagers, right? And say, like, hey, what do you need from us? How can we support you? and listen a little bit differently.
Right. And not have these preconceived notions that just because we were a teenager, we know exactly what that teenager is feeling or going through.
Yeah.
Or because we are professionals, we know what they should do. Yeah. I mean, high level, maybe some things, but I agree with you. Like, more adults should be listening to these teens. I mean, they're not idiots, they're actual humans with thinking brains, and they have some development to go, but they know what they're thinking and feeling.
Yeah. And I think like what we were talking just about our own experience in adolescence and being teenagers and young adults. And I don't think that it's the same.
Yeah.
So I can't assume, right? Like how kids are experiencing the world is still different. So
it's very different.
Yeah. Like I've got to come alongside them a little bit differently than perhaps even how someone parented or how we navigated adolescence a decade ago because of the pandemic and technology. Yeah. And just, I think kids and teenagers have a bit more emotional intelligence. Like they're more in tune with it.
Right.
So going back to like all of my pivot points and the, turning yourself around, I feel like that was a piece, is that the hard stuff wasn't always talked about, right? And there is some taboo to even the stigma of talking about relationships or breakups or unhealthy self-concept. And so I think that, that has really made me sit with not being a silent bystander to my own life, like recognizing like, oh, you have a voice within. And there can be either no one talking to you or too many people talking to you that have influence over the decisions you're making in life. And so every time I think I've come to a roadblock, I take it as an opportunity to say, okay, how can you build connection? How can you stay authentic? How can you experience courage to, live this one life that you have?
Yeah.
And so from the University of New England, I ended up practicing for a while in direct care with adolescents, and then eventually decided to take another risk. I just started a new job, and I loved my job at the hospital, but I also felt like I've been leading teams for a while, like right out of grad school, like asked to lead teams. And I thought, well, as a social worker, we practice this evidence-based stuff, right? Like we learn methods of therapy and we follow theory. And so I was like, how do I need to do that as a leader to be effective? But staying like true to who I am and really wanting to address social justice and social justice, even like, I think, helping the individual feel heard, like individuals and systems, but really like feeling the individual feel heard.
Right.
I was like, I'm going to get this doctorate in leadership and transformative leadership. And so I had started this new job and I was still in my doctoral program, and I actually had a new baby. So I had a toddler, a new baby. My husband and I had just finally moved out of living with my parents because we were living with my parents while I was doing my doctoral thing, and he was traveling for work, and we were trying to re-renovate this house. We just moved in, and I said, I have this idea. And he's like, oh no. Me having an idea is not always, he knows something is coming along with that. So I was like, I think I'm going to start applying to teach. Like, I think I really want to take a pause from like doing behavioral health, like direct practice and being a clinical director. And then I was a staff development specialist for a hospital. It's like, I think I just want to challenge myself. And lo and behold, Western Carolina University interviewed me, and they were like, and can you be here in 30 days? Oh. And so that was this huge pivotal point where it was kind of like, again, I talked to you about rejection, right? Like didn't go to the first university I wanted to out of high school, didn't get to go where I wanted to out of like starting grad school. Here now I'm in a doctoral program and I'm going to be teaching at a university, right? I was like, keep cheering, right? Like you always put on someone else's jersey and cheered for them, but what is it like to start wearing your own jersey? Like start cheering for yourself,
Love that.
Yeah. Like just cheer for yourself, put your own name on the back of your jersey and wear it around, like design the front of it however you want. So that was like this beautiful moment of risk and courage and like, okay, I might fail at this, but why not try?
Yeah. You won't know unless you try, right?
You don't know unless you try. And you have this one life to live. And so I feel like on my bucket list, I'm like, okay, like how far can you push yourself in a good way, right? Because you can feel like you can't, and the no's can turn into just like self-doubt and even more criticism. But if you reframe that idea, like what could be possible? Yeah. What could be possible?
That's great. That's great. So then you went to Western.
So I went to Western. Yes, I went to Western and taught.
And was your husband like, sure, let's pack up the house and go?
I mean, he's a really great guy. I think that he wouldn't be my husband if he wasn't. He's always been like, I think knows like I get like bored easy and want to like challenge myself. And I think as a family, I think it's important that my family, that my daughters see what life can be like take a risk. And sometimes it's hard and it doesn't go the way that you want. And, but don't sell yourself short. Right. And don't let the world sell you short.
Yeah.
So we went to Western. I was teaching there for 3 years, but I think another really pivotal time, a really hard time, was figuring out like once I climbed that mountain and I was like at the peak of what I thought was going to be the peak, it wasn't all I expected. And I think it wasn't all I expected because I hadn't found full community yet. And those people who, kept supporting me along the way, my family was all so far away. But so my stepdad had become really, really sick. And I went home for Thanksgiving that year, and we were really trying to figure out what our next larger family systems move was going to be. How were we going to support my mom? And how are we going to support his failing health? And so I remember like being really scared, but also really relieved in lots of different ways to just sort of saying like, I'm going to resign. I'm not going to teach. And I don't know what is next. That was the first time in my life, other than making a physical move, that I didn't have a clear path or plan, right? Like I knew, like, I love to talk about how people have these various values, right? Like supported by family, supported by friends, good health, respected in the community. Sometimes it's like, loving relationship. There are these values that we live by. And I was like, I just need to put like being there for my family first in a really different way. And everything else was just going to go by the wayside. I kept running every day. I was running up and down the lane we lived on in Asheville, listening to Miley Cyrus's The Climb. And I was like, I don't know what on earth is ahead. I don't know what is next, but I'm just going to have faith and trust that keep climbing.
Yeah.
Because even though you thought that you had been at this like the summit of what you had been working so hard for, like where you thought you were going to be, oh, maybe this is just like the first crest. And now you've got to find, you go back down and you're in the valley and you climb back up again. And so, the next chapter was Raleigh.
Wow.
The next mountain was Raleigh.
Yeah. That's awesome. I mean, what a great like symbolic image, of climbing, and then you think you're at the peak, and then you're not. Usually we go back down in the valley and we climb again. And taking the principles of cheerleading and just cheering yourself on, like keep climbing, keep going. You know, you're going to hit the top again at some point.
Yeah.
But recognizing, I think in life, like just because you hit the top, inevitably there's going to be a down at some point. And that's okay. It's acceptable. It's life.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think like, that's why I love these concepts of like blending being a mom and being a professional is because I feel like you can have a really stellar day in one area and really be struggling, right, in another. And sometimes both of them are like happening really great. But raising children or, you know, like even just being in partnership with somebody is hard to navigate and juggle all the moving parts. And so I love this idea of self-compassion. And, you know, Kristen Neff talks about it, like being these not always equal, but recognizing we have like joy and suffering.
Yes.
And as human beings, like our suffering doesn't have to be the end. We don't have to stay there. If we can surround ourselves with good people, right? And we can learn to like ourselves, right? To maybe love ourselves. Like there's a lot that's possible.
Yeah.
There's a lot that's possible. Like we are always stronger than we think we are.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. That's so good. So you moved back to Raleigh.
Yeah. So I came back to Raleigh. I didn't have a job. It was so wild, Sarah. I mean, like, you know, totally type A. I always have like, okay.
A plan.
The plan, right? The plan.
Or the plan that's going to happen after the first plan may not work out. I got a backup plan. Yeah.
Yes. And so like when I would tell people, they're like, when are you going to do? I'm like, I don't know. Maybe I'll be a barista. I've never done that before. And
that sounds fun.
I love coffee, right? Like I learned, I didn't even start drinking coffee until I was like 28 or 29.
Oh yeah.
And someone was like, girl, you're going to have to learn to drink coffee. If you're going to like have like toddlers and work full time and do this doctoral program.
Yeah.
You better learn to drink
that caffeine. Yeah.
Which is, you know, not always so great. But anyhow, so I was like trying to figure out what to do. And everyone's looking at me like, you don't have a plan? And I'm like, no plan. Like I literally just sat and waited like Dr. Seuss's The Waiting Place, right? Like I'm just like hanging out in the waiting room. Like what's gonna happen next? And I've predominantly worked when in direct practice with adolescents or adults, specifically with substance use disorders. And so I found a company who was looking to start an addiction recovery program. And so I ended up going there. But I think like turning the life around, like, you know, I resigned because not just for supporting my family. Like that was like 95% of it. But, you know, some of it was just like, it didn't fuel me and fill me the way I anticipated, which I really had to reconcile with. But, you know, after I resigned and the semester ended, my stepdad passed away in May before we even got here. So that reminded me, like, even when you do make the best of plans, you're not in charge of those plans. You're not in charge, right? Like, whatever your faith may be, right? Like someone, something bigger than me has a plan. And even I can try to put some ducks in a row. I can surrender my career and say, you know what? Like, all right, I'm going to put family first and I'm going to be here and hunker down and do this thing. Like, I still don't have, you know, full say. So, I had to sit with like, I gave up my career. I didn't really have a job. We're now in Raleigh, which I really loved Asheville. Like I love me some mountains of Asheville. But so I worked for that company for a while, and it's kind of a little like cathartic sitting with you here now because, like a year ago, not only did I start that new chapter at Bright Path, but the other chapter ended. I experienced rejection again. right? For the first time in my like professional life, I'd experienced like no's from applying to universities.
Yeah.
I'd experienced no's in relationships, you know, like someone doesn't really want to date you or the relationship ends, right? Or you know, you want to buy that house and the bank says no, right? Like I've experienced lots of other kind of rejections, but it was the first time I had experienced like a career rejection. So I had been laid off from my job and I didn't know what was going to be next. So again, I sat with like, ooh, here we are.
Yeah.
Right? This other moment. And I keep thinking about a lot of the turning points have been how there's like this blend of professional success and self, but the responsibility of like caring for the people in my life that I love and who are important to me, and figuring out how to have like the best of both of those things is sometimes tricky.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
I keep thinking about the concept of, you know, what cheerleading has taught you and me and other cheerleaders that are now professional, you know, professional working women. You know, and just thinking about your rejections, like you were just saying, and how, you know, when you're cheering on a team and they lose, and, you know that there's another basketball game next week and they're all going to put their uniform back on and go play again.
Yeah.
And you cheer them on to do that and internalizing that for ourselves. Like, okay, this thing ended or I got this rejection, but I'm going to have to put, you know, my shoes back on tomorrow morning and brush my hair and go back at it and cheer myself on. I think it's just such a really great concept.
Yeah. And I think like what we do as like counselors, as therapists is, you know, help. Like my goal is to cheer on the person, but how do I help them learn to cheer on themselves? And if I'm going to like preach that, how do I practice that? How do I model? How do I practice as a mom, as a practitioner, as somebody's like best friend, but in leadership, like how do I model that to my team, right? How do I model when the going gets tough? How do we honor that it is tough and maybe it didn't turn out the way we wanted, or how we had hoped or how we had planned, but what can we learn from that? Like as an individual, as a partnership, as a team, to keep moving forward, you know, like keep me moving forward.
That's so great. I think it's great wisdom and encouragement for sure.
Yeah.
Wow. So you've had a really great turning life around story, multiple points where you've pivoted and used rejections to fuel the next thing. Any words of encouragement that you might leave our listeners with?
Oh my goodness. So many, but you know, I will create it in so few. I think that it's really about figuring out how to find those who cheer for you and keep them close, right? Like the keeping good, positive people in your life is so important, and let go of those that don't cheer for you in a good way, right? And find the people who can help you stay authentic to you, meaning like, what are you doing? Like, that's not, you know, like holding you accountable.
Yeah, that's not who you are.
That's not who you are. And I think as like a mom or like a woman in leadership, it's important for people to keep me humble, keep me authentic. And so you need those friends who can cheer for you, but also like, you know,
challenge you.
And I think figure out how to, if you aren't already, like cultivate your own jersey, right? Like, what's it going to look like? Like, how embellished do you want it to be?
How much bling?
How much pink? How much pink, right? Like, all of that is so true. Like really just own who you are and I think the rest will follow.
I love that. That's great advice. Awesome.
Yeah.
I'm so glad that I have met another 4'11 cheerleader.
Yes.
And I really do hope that you're able to write your book one day.
Yeah.
I will read it for sure.
Okay, yeah.
Yes.
Maybe you can help me co-author. Yeah. Maybe we have some blending.
I'll just give you some quotes, but you go for it and you write it.
Yeah.
Let's plug Bright Path real quick. What is the website in case, or just will you just share just for a minute about Bright Path? And because it's in the area and I want people to know about it.
Yeah. Yeah. And, our founder was Pam Perkins, who lives in Wake Forest. And, I talked about those like women who have helped me get where I am. And it is amazing that she saw me a year ago when I was sort of at this really low point and like, ooh, I've like, I don't have a plan. I don't have this job. And so, she really listened and asked me to come and be the CEO of Bright Path. And so Bright Path in Wake Forest, we're serving adolescents. I'm back at like the heart of where my career started. And so serving 13 to 18-year-olds. And we have, all the social media spaces. So follow us on Instagram. We actually just started a challenge campaign today, encouraging people to share their why teen mental health, why really lead the cause. And so maybe that's also kind of cool today that we're talking about this. Like, I do it because I do teen mental health now still, because maybe that's what I really needed as a teen. And I was kind of like trying to figure it out the best that I could. But yeah, so follow us on social media, Instagram, Facebook. You can go to our website, brightpathbh.com. And we have some wonderful new staff and faces. So yeah, it's great. And I'm so honored to do what I do.
Yeah. And they are very honored, or they're very lucky to have you, and they should feel honored to have you leading them. So that's wonderful. Yeah. Thank you for chatting today.
Yes, absolutely. Thanks for having me.
Thanks so much for listening.